Okay. All right. Okay. I thought it was actually a three-way split, but it looks like there was a small margin towards out of band towards BMC. And I thought that we had more consensus around this, but it sounds like we kind of have, we're all kind of divided about what would be the better implementation. And some of this is probably along the lines of we all have a little bit like, I mean, obviously Dell has a little bit of a vested interest in the BMC implementation. And then I can see where if anyone's implemented thing or is in the process of developing around the UFI driver ready check that makes sense. And then is anyone here? And I will try and take notes as well. Here, let's see. Is anyone here actually a member of the PCI SIG or participates in the PCI SIG around these topics?
You know, our companies are. What is the?
Well, I mean, okay, so there is the option to where we kind of avoid, anything official through the PCI SIG, and we do we use DOE to kind of declare some attributes and do that. So I think if we had things, if we had something officially through the PCI SIG for boot coordination, right, you'd get a lot more adoption from different server OEMs on their implementation, right? Because I don't necessarily, I communicate with our BIOS team, but I don't necessarily represent them. And I'm just thinking of the changes that they would have to make for boot coordination and trying to get them to make those changes, right? So, whether it's a PCIe SIG doc or, something that we write a doc that describes what you do in the context of DOE, right? That defines what the attribute names are and things like that and the possible values. So the first going through official PCI SIG, I think, has the greatest possibility of moving the needle with server OEMs. But either way, we probably need to find a champion for each one of these methods that's going to actually drive them to a higher level of completion, right? Does everyone agree with that, or are there some questions about how we should proceed from here on?
Well, for the DOE, would we actually require, or what would we require from the SIG if we adopted DOE?
I don't think anything is needed from the SIG, because the SIG already defines a way to do to extend the mailbox with DOE using a GUID. I think the bigger question is what are the implications to the DPU IPU vendors, whether we go with PCI registers that will have to intercept a future PCIe spec, or whether we publish a DOE. And my question there was, could existing DPUs support the DOE method with just a firmware change without silicon change? Because that's what would make it a lot more attractive, in addition to not requiring a PCI spec or PCI SIG proposal.
Well, my concern is that maybe we're making an assumption regarding the DOE that the DOE is functional, right? I mean, the challenge that we're trying to work around today is that the registers are not functional when we think they should be functional.
Can you explain that a little bit? So I know peripherally, I have heard, and I'm assuming it's nothing proprietary, that there are some NVMe things that are going on in DOE, right? And that there is some BIOS support for it. But I don't know specifically for this option now.
I think what Reza is hinting at, when this DOE implementation on DPU is available, if it's software defined, then we didn't solve the problem, and it's still booting too late for us to actually do anything because nobody's responding on the other side. So DOE is just shifting the problem and not solving it. Reza, correct me.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
So that may be a misunderstanding from my side, but I thought that at least on some DPU implementations that are indeed software defined, that problem may be still there even if we define a proper PCIe register, because all of PCIe is software defined on such implementations, or maybe not.
So there's usually some hard timeouts associated with PCIe, right? That things have to work around in one way or another, right? So whether that has to go into some kind of ASIC or some kind of programmable that's available early on, I don't think you have the kind of time that you would need to necessarily boot like an entire Linux OS with services and those kind of things.
I think if we look into Reza proposal, I think that the first thing that really helping us is we defining a new static function. Why people today, if they're using software-defined PCI Express implementation, they are not willing today to kind of commit to the static functions, because they want to be very dynamic in the nature of, I'm booting in this profile or that profile, like exposing storage, networking, security, I'm doing this, that, I'm very flexible. So I think that the first proposal from Reza, if I understand correctly, his intention is here to correct me, is first of all, let's define the function that is one function, always present, static, and we use that function only for configuration status of the boot process synchronization. That's it. It shouldn't be flexible. So as those vendors implement, even if it's in software, it can be the very first thing that kind of available to you, and doesn't need to have any flexibility and profile checking and stuff like that.
Yes, that's correct. It's the predictability that we're after. Right?
And once we have that assumption, then the question is, are we going full-blown PCI SIG register definitions, or we can use DOE and I think some are pointing me of different examples of what DOEs today are. So some of them, Lee, I think that our BIOS team is doing, right? So some of them is SPDM, is DOE, if I understand. Some are, correct me if I'm wrong.
No,
One of them is CXL. All of those are DOEs.
There is a component measurement and authentication, CMA, which uses SPDM over DOE. But the point is, regardless if BIOS is the existing server BIOS supporting, let's say, component measurement and authentication or not, this will be new code to support the boot coordination for OPI. So I don't think that point is really very relevant for that data point. I'm more worried on the DPU side. If a DPU is already having some hardware that allows it to create DOE mailboxes with different content, and one of those, let's say, is CMA for PCIe component authentication, could they add the boot sequence coordination with just a firmware update to the DPU without having to spin the silicon? And the reason I keep picking on this is because that may be the difference between a solution that you could have within a year versus 3 years, right? but I hear Reza's concerns, and when if we are going to end up with this is firmware driven, and depending on the implementation, it doesn't resolve the problem, then yeah, you lose the advantage because you didn't solve the problem to begin with.
So, should we just file issues against these options as they're presented in the markup, and then try, because I mean, we're kind of we're raising some issues here, but I'm not sure that those are documented clearly as far as you know, need vendor agreement on having a well-defined static function, need vendor agreement on you know, timing and the
Yeah, part of the challenge is being able to respond, for a device to respond is just the requirement of being a good PCI citizen. And it seems that we're in a position where we have to specify something that's already specified, that it must work. And so it's this, never land that we find ourselves in. It just,
so I mean, what you're asking a PCIe function to respond to is not just information about itself, but information about a third party, right? Because we're asking it to tell us about the operation or the status of ARM cores or something, basically other services that are present on the XPU, right?
yes, that's what we're after. And we don't mind if those particular answers are delayed. But what we struggle with is when there's a failure in the physical communication. Right? That is, there's a timeout. So when there's a timeout, we crash the machine. That's what we're struggling with. And, like Samer pointed out, for silicon vendors to make changes to fix some of those things, it's going to be, those are generational changes. They're not incremental change, right? Because they require silicon change.
And by the way, Lee, just the voting data here is a bit skewed because I still insist that we need the ability to vote on more than one option, but the GitHub does not let us do that with this.
Yeah, I think I could have set the poll up that way. I was actually trying to drive towards consensus. I mean, I'll just be honest, right? So I was hoping that we could focus on one thing. Selfishly, I was hoping that we could, kind of drive one thing towards conclusion and then leave other things as optional. But
the issue is that, as we have in other sections and on the markdown, we acknowledge that there are DPUs, IPUs with BMC and those that without BMC. So that makes option 3, even though it's attractive for those that have BMC, it's not going to solve the full spectrum. So I still believe that some other solution is needed along with option number 3 if option number 3 is the winner. And option
so that's why I was trying to say platform BMC. I don't know if that's the term we've all kind of agreed to, but that's basically, I was talking about communication with the server BMC. Now, obviously, we're going to get into situations where there could be, within a given server with DPUs, you could have, 3 or 4 BMCs inside that box. You could have a BMC for each component, and things can get even more complicated from there, right? If they're trying to do some kind of, main subordinate kind of relationship, or if they're trying to aggregate that, it can get very complicated. But so the reason I talk about the platform BMC, because okay, so if the XPU is sharing power with the server, right, with the rest of the server, if it's getting power from the server's power supplies, right, it implies to me that there is a BMC involved that's on the server.
So you consider option number 3, you could have a platform BMC on the server and no BMC on the IPU DPU.
Correct.
And everything we discussed for option 3 would still apply?
Yes.
Because it's PLDM MCTP based.
Right, because the BMC is seeing the XPU as a peripheral, right? Now, the part where I waved my hands and it's not really defined is the communication between the platform BMC and the BIOS, right? Because for different OEMs, it's not really expressed how the BMC can delay BIOS, right, before PCIe enumeration. Because the main thing with option 3, we're all talking about, okay, we don't have to worry about static function because we're going to stop boot of the server between the point where we get power to the DPU, right, and the point where BIOS is going to start looking at the PCIe bus, loading drivers, and then eventually get to the point where it sets boot order, right? So we're trying to stop it as early on as possible so that we don't have to have static functions. We don't care. At this point, nothing is being looked at on the PCIe bus. So if we change things, it doesn't matter, right? So that's kind of the goal of option 3, right? And it's assumed that the platform BMC can work with the BIOS because they both come from the same vendor to be able to accomplish that. Now, if you're working with, I'm not sure that that's totally possible with OpenBMC and straight, ED2K2, whatever UEFI, right?
Yeah, some standardization would be needed there in DMTF if that is to work with and be interoperable with different BMC and BIOSes.
Yeah,
I suggest to put it out of scope. It's not a common thing. We're talking about server platforms usually, whether it's Dell, HP, Supermicro, Lenovo, others. So those platforms usually tightly coupled with their implementation of BIOS and the implementation of iDRAC for more than just DPUs. So I think we can, I even stated it on some documentation page, that we can leave it out of the scope and let the server vendors worry about this is the standard or non-standard way coordinating between the BMC and BIOS. I think what we should focus is standardizing the communication between the platform or server BMC to the DPUs. That's one. And after we do that, we can explore a possibility to standardizing maybe inside the DPU how we report the progress. Maybe if we're running ARM cores and we're running UEFI and ATF in the DPUs, maybe we can standardize or put changes or even automatic reporting of boot status from the ATF UEFI of the DPU themselves, maybe to help DPU vendors to achieve a little bit more commonality, or we can also leave it as a proprietary implementation for them to report these boot statuses by themselves.
So I agree with Boris on leaving it out of scope. I just wanted to point out that we are having now a growing number of platforms, especially like ARM servers, that are more of a mix of an ecosystem of open components, and it's very common to see a BIOS vendor provide the UEFI, OpenBMC on the BMC, or both are open source. And ARM has a set of standards where we try to regulate some of the BMC and BIOS communication through a specific channel we call the sideband channel. So there is work happening there, and that includes some signaling for things like firmware updates, for example.
I don't disagree, Summer.
Yeah, but that can be outside the
that.
scope of OPI. I agree with you on that. Yeah.
We can start with out of scope, then we can bring it in scope if something there is interesting. For sure, we can try to standardize that. From the open source perspective, I also propose, again, standards is all good, but I think that OPI formed also to produce some code. So from the code perspective, we can also start maybe as OPI to contribute to, let's say, OpenBMC, just for the sake of the argument, to increase adoption across those platforms, Summer, like you're saying, and produce maybe a reference or even implement that in OpenBMC code, how this synchronization will look like. So other vendors can implement it in the same way on their proprietary platforms, whether it's ILO, iDRAC, and other BMC implementations.
Yeah, thanks, Boris. I think that's a good approach.
Yeah, I guess I was just, it's not enough. Well, I just want to make sure that if we communicate things over to an entity, it has the ability to do what we need it to do. If the platform BMC can't do what we need it to do, then communicating boot status to it doesn't help. So, all right.
So what about option 2? I hear a lot of discussion on 1 and 3, and they seem to both have potential and some opens and things to work on. What about 2?
2 has the same original problem. Yeah, it assumes that the fundamental hardware communication works.
Yeah, you're in, it's really about where you're at in the boot, right? Because option 1 kind of happens at PCIe discovery potentially, and option 2 would happen a little later when you're loading drivers and well, you're saying that there'd be an option ROM, right? It would be a driver that was carried with the device, and the loading of that driver would then have extra capabilities in it that would be leveraged by the BIOS, right?
Not leverage. I think it was just it will hold the system. Basically, it will not return back to the BIOS. If I understood number two, but I think what we are saying is, if in number one, we may end up not recommending DOE because if its firmware implementation still has the issue, then we didn't really solve the problem. Option two is definitely going to have the issue as compared to option one, DOE. So it sounds to me like, if we are debating DOE for option one because of possible implementations, option two is not even a starter.
Yeah, I guess, well, it's the logic in option two is in the option ROM as opposed to as long as you have a static function there, it doesn't have to do much other than be available and be something that has a driver attached to it that you can load, right? And then all of the delays and the business logic happen in the context of the driver running on the server, right?
But when Reza was talking about option one and why DOE might not solve the problem, we're saying that you might have crashes in the server during PCI enumeration if the device does not respond correctly.
Yeah.
So option two
Right.
is even a much later stage, right?
Yeah. So basically the PCIe bus has to be well behaved, right? For option one or option two to work. So one of my questions to the BIOS team, and I didn't get an answer back, was whether or not this enumeration and loading of drivers happens in parallel across multiple devices, kind of trying to understand what else could be happening at this point of time, right? And if there's any complications with that, right? So, obviously, so one of the things that people talk about is, okay, I want to be able to have maybe a static function that's always there, right? But then I want to be able to add and remove NVMe devices based on, configuration and things that don't happen until the services on the ARM core actually run and can talk to a target and get a config and all this other stuff, right? So if you need that, is BIOS going to hold off on this one function and not enumerate any other, physical functions and on that slot until this one's done? Or is he going to keep trying to enumerate? What's going to happen there, right? And what are the limitations?
Yeah, so BIOS has an expectation that if the device is present, that it will respond, and it will respond according to the spec, right? And in conformance with the spec, meaning that it will either provide an answer right away, or it will do a read retry, or whatever the retry mechanism is. And of course, that comes with a timeout. But if BIOS sees that, oh, there's a device out there and it's responding reasonably well, then it will try to enumerate that device. But if the device did not respond at all, BIOS thinks that nothing is present and it moves on. So
it won't try to enumerate multiple devices in parallel. It'll
that's
stop.
correct. Yeah. It's and Summer probably knows this better. It's very sequential in nature.
Yeah, it's UEFI is single-threaded, although there is a timer running that allows events to fire that have higher priority. Those events would be doing things like housekeeping and other internal BIOS stuff. They would not be doing PCI enumeration of other devices in parallel.
what about, are there any watchdog timers that might trip if you don't progress in BIOS?
It could happen. There is no guarantee there. That was actually one of the points I did point out on the markdown. Because there's this timer that's running in BIOS that allows you to have higher priority events to be serviced. Think of it as the only interrupt that's running is a timer interrupt, and it runs at a regular interval. And every time the timer interrupt happens, it checks if there are any events in the event queue and whether the task priority level, the priority of those events are higher than the current context that's running. And if it is, then it will service those interrupts and will execute that event. And that essentially, for example, the exception handler is one like that. For some exceptions for software triggered exceptions. Now, I haven't seen a watchdog timer in implementations that times out on drivers. There is a watchdog timer that's mandated by the UEFI spec that times out when trying to boot an OS, and the OS bootloader does not respond after a certain time.
Yeah, that's what I was familiar with. I was just wondering if it also applied here as well.
No, it's not architected in UEFI, but it could be implemented, and I would not really know if that would be legal or not without going into the code. But it's in theory, it's possible.
Okay.
I also think that it is less of control of the system BIOS, because BIOS does not expect option ROMs to hold for a really long time, versus if there's a deliberate handshake that was being done between the BIOS and the device, let's say, for example, using option 1, or if it's BMC driven and the BIOS is made aware using option 3, then you can message it to the user better. With option 2, hey, we're initializing devices, I think what the Dell PowerEdge says, right? And then 5 minutes pass and you don't know what's going on, right?
Yeah, it is. It's good to be able to at least do something on the splash screen to let the user know that, hey, we are doing something in the background and you don't need to pull the cord. We are going to resolve this. We're making progress, because if you don't show them if you don't show a user any kind of progress indicator for 5 minutes, then they have a tendency to yank the power from you. So,
and there was an earlier question, Lee, about the one static function and then some other functions dynamically added based on configuration. That could happen with all of these options. So I think where you end up there is you end up with recursive cycles of re-enumeration and rediscovering option ROMs and running the sequence for child devices that were discovered. So there might be some interleaving between the enumeration and the option ROM phase in that case.
okay. I just know that not all servers support hot plug of all devices, right? So I just didn't want to get into a scenario where basically UEFI is going to crash because it thinks the device is unhealthy. Or it won't ever come back to it as far as the boot order is concerned. All right, so I didn't have anything, any other topics for today. I know that someone had reached out from another working group about they were proposing enhancements to the ZDP, and maybe we can. They're asking if those enhancements could potentially be integrated, but I was trying to get more of a clarity of what that might be.
I'm sorry, Lee, before you move on to the next topic,
Uh-huh.
if you, I just voted, so if you can refresh your screen.
Oh,
that's
okay.
one. And the other is, when are you closing this vote? And what's the threshold?
Well, so I mean,
And how binding is it?
so this was a straw poll. Let's just call it a straw poll because it's
Okay.
not official. And I don't know. So, and this is kind of gets into another topic of like, perhaps we need more regulation and rules. And I'm not. I mean, I'm very familiar with like working inside of DMTF. I'm not as familiar of working inside of Linux Foundation. And, you know, maybe someone else has better insight for that, you know, is kind of as far as like meeting rules and voting and things like that, right? You know, like I know DMTF had kind of like, you know, they have a 24-hour rule where if you want to do a presentation, it has to be uploaded 24 hours before, and then pretty much everything proceeds along the lines of, you know, like somebody makes a suggestion, then somebody has to second it, and then we kind of do everything through a, you know, mutual consent kind of. You just hear that, you know, approved by mutual consent over and over again throughout the meeting, and then we kind of have kind of a standing, like in this kind of form, we would have, you know, we'd start off with whatever the agenda was, and then we'd have pull requests, or we'd have, yeah, pull requests, review pull requests, and then beyond pull requests to go to defects, you know, that were submitted inside of GitHub. And then either you say whether or not it's a real defect, or, you know, kind of you vote on whether or not it's a real defect and then assign somebody to it or not. You know, so there was kind of more of a structure to it, right?
So I have a big question, Lee and Reza and Summer and others. I see very little amount of participation in OPI, or, you know, we are not a standard body. And back to Reza questions, how binding these decisions are and stuff like that. So my question is, should we consider taking the specifications that we want to happen into the proper specification bodies instead of making them OPI, like DMTF, like PCI SIG, like any other organization that is really, really good at producing specs and very well recognized, versus open source Linux Foundation project that we are. So again, we can work together and everything, but they will be the owner of the spec and the publisher of the spec and stuff like that. That probably be much more binding, official, and
Do that, but you have to be aware of the special rules on IP contribution for each one of those standard bodies. Some of the standard bodies are traditionally, they all have come from a word of non-disclosure and you know, non-compete agreements, where everything happens in private inside the standards body and by member companies, and then eventually the spec is ratified and published and becomes public, and by that time it's too late to make a comment on it from people that are not already in the forum. Some forums like UEFI have been adapting and try to be more open and accepting submissions that are external from open source or from an open community such as OPI. Some forums like DMTF still do not have a clear process, but they have been trying to work with things like the OpenBMC community. Some like PCI SIG, I don't think they have any process for external submissions.
I agree with you. It's not easy, but I believe this is a more successful route. So DMTF has also code contributors. As you know, they created a lot of code on DMTF on the GitHub as well. They also good at doing specs. We can start with maybe listing the names of the proper standard bodies that we think that, out there that is relevant. I know DMTF did a lot of work with specifically GPUs on the Redfish side, for example, so they know this topic, they understand what is going on, and we can reach out and see what kind of agreement we can reach with them or what kind of collaboration we can do. I don't know, just a suggestion. I know it's a big one, but I kind of very skeptical that we can achieve that level of consensus or having any kind of real industry impact in this forum.
Yeah, and to add to what you're saying, Boris, I think you have the advantage of having the real experts on a specific technology that can help make progress. So for example, let's say we say option 3 and we want to proceed with option 3, getting down into the nifty details of the MCTP or PLDM and sequences and putting that in a spec in a generic way that could apply to other devices too, not just to OPI.
Yeah. Exactly. And PLDM came from DMTF, so they have expert there. A lot of DOE functions, if we're talking about option number 1, again with SPDM and stuff came in from DMTF. So this is like my thinking for the past several weeks been, and I just wanted to use it, suggest it openly, and we can all discuss, agree, disagree, but I don't kind of see any other choice for us, but wanted to bring this.
Yeah, but just to finish on my thought earlier, I have done this with another similar forum that is semi-open, and then we contribute to industry standards, including DMTF, and we've been doing that for a few years. And in the semi-open forum, there are many companies that are not, let's say, DMTF members or PCI SIG members. And I found that for this to really work, unfortunately, it becomes a one-way submission into the industry standard, but then you can't share back the feedback and the progress on the spec back with the open forum, because now you are governed by that forum's non-confidentiality agreements. So unless the individual contributors go and join that forum, they will not see the progress on that ECR until it materializes as spec.
The
until
advantage
DMTF publishes, right, as a work in progress, for example.
Sorry, the advantage here is we have very little amount of members in OPI. So if I'm just looking at DMTF, just an example, members list or participants list, like HP is there, Dell is there, ARM is there, NVIDIA is there, Marvell is there, Intel is there, IBM is there, like everybody, at least that joins those calls, and all our DPU vendors, at least, that publicly participate in those Supermicro is there, like everybody is there. So we don't have so much members anyways, but the ones that we do have, they kind of already participants, at least for DMTF. So that simplifies a little bit what you're saying, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But on our GitHub and our Markdown, it will become a one-way ticket, right? That topic moved to DMTF. There is no more updates on the public GitHub and public Markdown. We can't legally, even if we all know the answer.
Yeah, until it's ratified. Yeah, I agree. So until it's ratified, and then we can update the links to the public.
Correct. Or we request that they publish an early preview. DMTF has been good about that as well. They publish in progress.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, that was gonna be kind of my follow-up question, whether we would keep this forum and then elect, a couple members to represent into the forum, or if we would just try and get, enough participation from all the represented companies here, right?
I just say we have well-defined problems that are really simple to move into standard bodies, and we can all then free our time to discuss next topics, right? We only started on boot synchronization. We talked very little about crash and dump synchronizations, right? And reboots and the coordinated shutdowns. We had a lot of topics that Steven wanted to bring up, is about lifecycle management of the DPUs, creating a standard protocol for reboots and firmware updates and software loading and all of that stuff. We have a lot of pages that we just don't have time to get to because we are tied up into the topic that is very important, but I think we has less successful chances to solve by ourselves versus the experienced standard body with a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience how to do the specs properly. Just my 2 cents, sorry.
So we're thinking, I guess we need to be kind of organized of what we defer off to another organization, or we're trying to like kind of package things up and say, okay, now we've defined the scope and now we need someone to take this into a standards body and get a standard to come out.
I think so. These kind of 3 options, we discussed it a lot, and I think it's pretty mature to move into one of the standard body. If we're talking about out-of-band platform management, BMC, for example, option number 3, DMTF with PLDM help us define all the proper registers that we use for boot synchronization. I think that's a perfect fit for that kind of work. And if they can help us also on option number 1, which is also very viable in the platforms that don't have platform BMC, but a little bit longer term. So they can help us either define DOE objects or help us with maybe PCI SIG. They have a lot of experience with PCI specific things. I'm just asking other people opinion what they think is the right route.
It seems reasonable to me. That seems like a prudent path. Of course, we have to be explicitly clear in terms of what we want.
Yeah, I agree with Reza. For instance, if we send this to DMTF on option 3, we have to get results that satisfy the original problem statement. They will try to make it more generic, but we have to participate there and make sure it solves our problem statement. And then if we expect them to go to PCI option 1 and then they drop the ball on that, we need to decide, is that still important for us in OPI or not? And if so, then we have to take it, or someone has to take it to PCI SIG along the same lines as taking it to DMTF.
100% agree with Summer.
And by the way, option 2 does not really have an industry standard to move it, because if you take it to UEFI, you're just going to have some puzzling looks and saying, why are you doing that?
I think that option 2 is basically doing nothing, because this is how UEFI already operates. For example, for NVMe drives, it already waits for NVMe status bit to become ready. So option 2 is basically do nothing.
Yep.
Okay. I guess we got about 3 minutes left. So I guess this week we need to work independently and kind of figure out. Well, it would be nice if over Slack and stuff we could kind of communicate like what our different participations in these other standards bodies are, like how many people in this forum participate DMTF, right? Who
I
would be a
think
good,
this week, Lee, if you don't mind, this week we should bring this topic to TSC. And at least throw it there that this is, we seriously thinking about moving this specific topic to one of the standard body, and hear from our technical steering committee or board even that they are okay with that, or they have completely total objection and we should not explore this anymore, because this is kind of a big decision, and if we are not aligned with TSC and board in OPI, we cannot move forward with this
okay, when's that meeting?
on Thursdays.
Okay. All right. Okay, were there any other parting remarks before we close for the day? All right. Appreciate everyone's participation. I think we had a very constructive meeting.
All right, thanks, guys. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.